when you read through the Bible, there's a few disciples of Jesus that get their time in the limelight, and they get more than just a mere mention in Scripture. Most of them carry on the torch passed on to them, but there was one of them who became famous for an entirely different reason, and then somebody had to fill his shoes. Today we'll be looking at an apostle who didn't start off as one of the 12 apostles that we all know about, and like Paul, he was a later addition to the title of apostle. Yep, today we're talking about Matthias, the man who had some really strange shoes to fill, those of the betrayer of Jesus, Judas Iscariot. So let's start off by talking about this Judas Iscariot. Judas was, of course, part of the original Jesus gang, and like most of the disciples, the Gospels don't tell us too much about him. They do take pains, however, to make sure that we know which Judas they're talking about by their use of the surname Iscariot, and there are actually a couple of ideas about this surname and its meaning too. Firstly, there are some ideas that this is a Greek version of the phrase of Kerioth. Now, this wasn't uncommon, as Jesus is often referred to as Jesus of Nazareth. A second explanation is that Iscariot might be a corruption of the Latin Sicarius, which meant that Judas could have been a member of the Sicari, which, well, that's a cool topic in itself. But I will leave you with a teaser. It means dagger men, and it's so interesting, I think I'm going to need to make a video on it. The last theory about the Iscariot surname is that Iscariot was a posthumous nickname that the other apostles gave to him once he'd gone. One that meant betrayer, constricted, choking, and that very neatly leads us on to the next part. Judas, of course, was one of Jesus' main 12 followers, and he became famous, or shall we say, infamous, for betraying him. A few reasons in Scripture are given for this betrayal, and they include the following. One is greed, where he is shown to be the mission's financial guy, who, as well as reportedly embezzling funds, was paid off to change sides. Then there is demonic influence, where he was possessed by Satan in order to stop Jesus continuing his mission. Outside of the Scriptures, there is of course a political angle. In Jewish thought at the time, the Messiah was supposed to lead the Jews in recreating the old kingdom and starting a new golden age, starting by booting out those pesky Romans. So Judas was unhappy with the way that his teacher that he'd been following was going about things. After all, Jesus wasn't the only street preacher that was floating around at the time, and he wasn't doing an awful lot of Roman overthrowing. Whatever his motivation was, Judas caused the arrest and eventual execution of Jesus, and shortly after was recorded as having suffered immense remorse and hung himself, or he died in an accident, but either way, he died in a field which was nicknamed the Field of Blood because it was either bought with blood money or it was covered in Judas's literal blood. Judas, of course, had sure etched his place in history for good or for ill, and theologians would discuss him for centuries after, causing us to ask deep questions about free will and determinism. But why did Judas need to be replaced? Well, this all stems from something that Jesus said about the apostles. Jesus claimed that each of the 12 would get a tribe of Israel to rule over in the coming kingdom, so it was reasonable to assume that they thought that after recent events, Judas wouldn't be taking up that position. Finally then, we get to Matthias. So, in the book of Acts, we are told of a rather unusual scene. A replacement for Judas is chosen by drawing straws from a bunch of believers that had been with Jesus since the very beginning. Now, often it's portrayed that Jesus was just hanging around with the disciples and nobody else, but scriptures actually do show us that he'd gained quite the fan base. Those that could follow him would follow him around, and it was easy to see why the authorities at the time were getting a bit worried about him. 13 guys wandering around preaching, well, that's easy to manage, not really a blip on the radar. But if it's 50 to 100 of them, well, the soldiers might be sharpening their swords just in case. Jesus, of course, had risen and ascended to do his thing, and before Pentecost, the disciples pondered who should fill Judas's shoes. At the time, there were about 120 followers, and out of these, 2 candidates were chosen on the basis that they had been following Jesus since his baptism. The two men were a chap called Barsabas, and the other was the subject of today's video, Matthias. After some prayer, the two drew straws and Matthias won, becoming the replacement of Judas. And, just like with all the rest of the apostles, he's never mentioned again, and there's varying stories about what happened to him after Pentecost and who he even was. So yes, as always, there's a bit of an identity crisis when we're talking about Matthias, and in one translation of Eusebius's works, he's referred to as Ptolemy. Clement of Alexandria hints that he might have been Zacchaeus from one of Jesus' encounters. If you don't remember who that is, Zacchaeus was a little tax collector who hid in a tree in order to hear Jesus' preaching. Others thought that he might actually be Barnabas, Paul's old mission partner. And later on, some theologians thought that he might be Nathaniel, who we learned about when we talked about Bartholomew. Sadly, like with some of the other apostles, there are not many tales of Matthias' ministry to be found, not even in the Golden Legend, and just like his peers, there are a few contradictory accounts. One tradition states that he set about preaching on the coast of the Caspian Sea, and another states that he did what a lot of believers did, which was to annoy the people in Jerusalem, get stones thrown at him, and then got beheaded. Another account states that he preached in Judea for a bit and then set off for the Colchis area, which is in modern-day Georgia, where he may have met his end. If he didn't meet his end there, then he may set off for Ethiopia, where barbarians, meat-eaters and cannibals didn't like his message too much and then stoned him to death. And sadly, this is kind of where the tales of Matthias ends, overshadowed by the guy that he replaced. But we still have 4 more apostles to go, so next time we'll be looking at the only apostle to write a gospel, Matthew. So until next time, cast lots for your next drink purchase and keep asking questions.